Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, and of course, our students. Welcome to yet another Saatchi Library and Information Center engagement. We, of course, are very busy these days. So we've started the year hitting the ground running. So you all will, of course, have vivid memories of last week's very robust and, I dare say, exuberant exchanges when we hosted the Cuban ambassador. Just this morning, we hosted the former United States ambassador to the African Union and now Dean of International Relations at the Elliott School of International Relations at George Washington University, and here we are again. So let me start by welcoming you all on behalf of Dr. Ruqayya Bawa and her team in the Library and Information Center, and of course, my team, the South African Research Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. We take our public engagement very seriously. We thrive on the idea of bridging the gap between theory and practice and do some policy engagement. With that said, let me just remind you about some house rules as we go along. So this is a live podcast, and I've learned last week that apparently I like to stand here because I like to see myself on television. Just want to remind you that my mother used to tell me I've got the voice for TV and the face for radio. So that's not quite true, that I enjoy the camera, but I've learned. So what I now do, I ask the students to come share the camera with us to also make it onto the very big screens of Dr. Ruqayya Bawa. So this event is again another live podcast, meaning that some of our students and academics at our other three campuses at Doornfontein, Bunting Road just down the road here, and of course our Soweto campus are listening in. I'm looking forward to the day, Dr. Bawa, when they will be able to join us and actually participate in the discussions from where they sit. But I know you're working on the technology. It is my distinct pleasure today to preside over another event, and this time around, the launch of a hefty, thick magnum opus. It's not called 50 years of research, or at least research on 50 years of politics in Zimbabwe for nothing. So it's my distinct pleasure and privilege. I haven't seen Dave Coltart in a long time, but David Coltart, the author of our book, The Struggle Continues, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe. I would like to stress the subtitle, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe, to show you it's clearly not going to be a dull discussion we're going to have this evening, published by Jacana Media. Dave, welcome to you. It's indeed a distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you. I cannot promise you that our students will not ask you difficult questions, but you are more than welcome. I'll introduce Dave in a moment. I've also asked friend and colleague, Professor David Moore. I regard Professor Moore as one of the foremost analysts on Zimbabwean questions and questions of political economy in Zimbabwe, South Africa, the region, and internationally, as one of the foremost thinkers and writers on the subject matter. So when I was asked by Dr. Bawa who I would recommend, I did not hesitate to recommend Professor David Moore. And then just yesterday, I saw another old confidant. I haven't seen him in ages, Piers Spigu from the International Crisis Group. He attended yet another event we had yesterday on South Sudan. And I would like to publicly state, I effectively ambushed him and asked him to be on today's panel. David responded by saying, I do notice that you've asked 3 white men to serve on the panel. So I just want to get that out of the way. And I retorted and I said it was deliberate. So welcome and good luck to you, Piers Spiegel. So Piers, actually, I gave him a copy of the book, Dave, you'll be glad to hear, and I can assure you when to go and read it, in part because he couldn't stop reading it. It was fascinating. So let me now just briefly introduce our author and main speaker, and then we can get the show underway. David Coulthard's roots in Africa goes deep. He's grown up in Zimbabwe. His authoritative works that he've done on Zimbabwe spans at least 60 years of Zimbabwean history. The one point I would like to emphasize about Dave Coulthard, and I remember in those days, Dave, when I tried to, David Moore will also remind you, tried to be in a minority of one in this country, defending quiet diplomacy. So I met Dave in that context, and I'm sure it's going to come up in the discussions today. But the one point I would like to single out about Dave Coulthard is that he has a very long and active history working with opposition movements and organizations in Zimbabwe, not just post-independence, but even before the Zimbabwean independence process, and certainly after the declaration of the unilateral declaration of independence by the then Prime Minister Ian Smith in 1965. With that said, Dave, you are most welcome. I'm going to give you what, 20 to 25 minutes, 30 minutes, as you feel free. Introduce the book, talk us through what motivated you to write the book, how long it took, and most important, we're looking, of course, to some of the thick and important narrative contained in the book. So Dave Coulthard, welcome to you. Welcome to the University of Johannesburg, and over to you. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming Dave Coulthard. You can sit. It's the more comfortable, the better.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. The title says much about the book. It was obviously deliberately chosen. The main reason behind the dominant title, namely "The Struggle Continues," is to describe the ongoing struggle for democracy and freedom in Zimbabwe. But it is somewhat ambiguous in that it also represents the personal struggle that each one of us encounters in our respective lives. And I'm no exception. And the book does trace the variety of personal struggles, often struggles about one's outlook and one's past and the baggage of one's past, which I hope in my own case is not a finite struggle. It is an ongoing struggle, as the broader struggle for democracy in Zimbabwe is. The subtitle, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe, has, I suppose, was deliberately designed to provoke, and it has already done that. I've had two sort of reactions from both extremes. Some people within ZANU-PF have said, how dare you describe the last 36 years of rule in Zimbabwe as tyranny? And at the other extreme, I've had white Rhodesians write to me to say, how dare you say that the period between 1965 and 1980 was a period of tyranny? My own belief is that if you look at the common definition of tyranny, both eras are marked by arbitrary, oppressive rule, and therefore amount to tyranny. The book, however, goes beyond 50 years. The 50 years was chosen because of one anniversary which has occurred recently. In November last year, November the 11th, 2015, we saw the 50th anniversary of the unilateral declaration of independence by Ian Smith on the 11th of November 1965. And although the problems within then Southern Rhodesia started obviously before that, that date in my mind was a pivotal moment when tyranny actually became deeply entrenched in Zimbabwe, and its legacy survives to this day. The book's span, though, goes beyond the 50 years. It goes, in some respects, back to 1820, when my ancestors came to the Eastern Cape of South Africa. But of course, it focuses on the almost 60 years of my life. I'm 58 now. I was born in October 1957, and just 4 months after I was born, a progressive, a man who was charting Southern Rhodesia on a new course, namely Garfield Todd, lost office. And I mark that date as negative, as positive as Garfield Todd's rule was. The day he was removed from office was a very negative day in our country's history. And I chart that history from that date. How long did it take me to write this, you ask? About 18 months. One of the ironies of this is that it took the loss of an election in July 2013 to open up the time I needed to write this. I lost that election by some 19 votes. We had the military voting early and often, as they say, in the election in 2013. They did a very effective job. In one sense, it was negative, but I seized that opportunity, and I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity to write this book. Rather than go into the book, David has suggested that I read 3 portions of the book, which I hope will give you a flavor for some of the themes that the book seeks to address. So the first paragraph comes from the period when I served in the Rhodesian forces. I've deliberately...
Try this, and then you can check the pages.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep. I certainly can.
Before I read this section, I need to recount a discussion that we had at last night's launch in Cape Town. Professor Brian Raftopoulos was the interlocutor, and he challenged me on my assertion that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a constructive, positive feature of South Africa's transition from white minority rule to majority rule. And my response was that I realized the imperfections of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I also said that I think that South Africans have unrealistic expectations of the transformation of South African society. We don't understand that the legacy of apartheid is not going to be undone in just a few decades. The damage done by apartheid goes so deep into the structures of South African society, and indeed the structures of Zimbabwe society, that it is going to take possibly generations to fully work through and resolve the horrors caused by apartheid. I think one of the greatest tragedies of Zimbabwe was that we didn't even have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As imperfect as that body was, it allowed the actors at the time to be confronted by the horrors of their own work, to have an opportunity to try and cleanse themselves, to speak about it, to perhaps be forgiven. And whilst it didn't achieve reconciliation as I'm sure all South Africans hoped would be achieved, I do think it marked a very important step along the way. Zimbabwe never had that opportunity, and one of the things I'm seeking to achieve in this book is as honest a recollection of my own experience. I understand full well that ZANU-PF are going to latch onto the early chapters, take them in isolation, and use them to further their propaganda. But I feel very strongly that someone needs to make a start about saying what happened in the past, so that, yes, perhaps we open up a few wounds, but they are festering just beneath the surface. And I think only by opening up these wounds and shining light and putting salt in them can we begin to heal society. That applies to South Africa and Zimbabwe. So I want you to hear this in that context. And I'm talking about torture used by the Rhodesian security forces. I've been left with a profound sense that torture is evil. Although I was aged just 19 at the time, I am ashamed that I did not do more then to prevent its use or speak out against it. However, I believe that it is only through such revelations that we can prevent the use of these antediluvian practices in future. My war experiences formed the foundation for my absolute opposition to the use of violence in any conflict, and my hatred of war itself. Tragically, the use of torture has become deeply ingrained in our law enforcement agencies. Torture has been used ever since and is still used by the British South Africa Police's successor, the Zimbabwe Republic Police, and other state agencies to this day. Aside from it being reprehensible and a crime against humanity, in my later experience as a defense counsel, it has been shown time and time again to be a poor method of obtaining reliable intelligence. These crimes, along with atrocities committed by all the armies in the war, were never prosecuted, as they were covered by an amnesty agreed to by all the parties to the Lancaster House settlement in 1979. The amnesty, combined with the absence of any truth commission, resulted in these horrors never being confronted and dealt with, as they should have been. The use of torture within our security forces remains a plague in our nation. The second section deals with a period when I represented ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo's party, in the 1980s. It was a transition. It was part of my own journey in coming to grips with my past and the reality of the new Zimbabwe. Early in 1990, I was approached by Bulawayo councillor Nelson Sidanile to see whether I would be prepared to stand as an MP for ZANU-PF in Bulawayo. Sidanile was an old client. In August 1985, he instructed me to sue the police and its police intelligence security unit for unlawful detention and assault. He, like so many other ZAPU councillors, had been detained at Stops Camp and was severely tortured by 2 PC policemen. He was beaten up, tied upside down, and then subjected to water torture with a wet blanket being thrown over his head. Before we could get legal proceedings underway, he was detained again, this time on the utterly bizarre allegations that he had accused the police for having arrested him for no apparent reason, and that the Minister Nkala's policemen were harassing people holding peaceful meetings. It was apparently an offense to claim that the police had acted unlawfully. Unsurprisingly, Sidanile was never charged with that offense, but he continued to have run-ins with the Central Intelligence Organization and the Police Internal Security Organization. His swan song with them before the signing of the 1987 Unity Accord happened when he was detained again on the 17th September 1987 on allegations that he was assisting dissidents in Matabeleland North Province. As he was held under emergency powers regulations, there was little I could do to secure his release. But on the 1st of October, I got a message from his wife that he had been refused his Bible by the police. That day, I had a meeting with Inspector D. Chamba, the head of the police internal security in Bulawayo, who told me straight-faced that Sidanile was not allowed a Bible because, I quote, Jesus wrote politics. My entreaties must, however, have done some good, because later that day, Sidanile was released, never to be detained again. In all this, we had become good friends, and I suppose that is the reason he felt I might be a good ZANU-PF MP. I was somewhat taken aback by the request, as I had never considered standing for Parliament, far less standing for ZANU-PF. Without turning him down, I suggested that he first see if there was a consensus within ZANU-PF regarding my nomination. He went away to find out. His suggestion apparently went down like a lead balloon within the ZANU-PF hierarchy. I was mightily relieved to hear that I didn't have to disappoint him. The final section comes from the concluding chapter of the book, where I venture a bit into philosophy. I'm not a philosophical type. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. But one of my profoundly held beliefs regarding Zimbabwe is that we have an entire nation affected by post-traumatic stress syndrome. We are a nation which has been afflicted by a war which affected every single household in Zimbabwe. Those households were affected in a far worse manner in some respects than even South African households during apartheid, because we had the militarization of an entire generation. And I think that that element in our society has caused so much trauma in our nation, even in the last 36 years post-independence. I read as follows. One explanation for this, and for this I talk about ZANU-PF destroying its own legacy, must be the effect that post-traumatic stress syndrome has had on an entire generation of Zimbabweans. The reality of that legacy was forcefully brought home to me when I met Zimbabwean war veterans in November 2010. Zimbabwe has experienced similar trauma, indeed even worse in one respect than post-Vietnam America. In Zimbabwe, many of the protagonists are still in the same country the war was fought in. Nothing has been done to heal the wounds of the 1970s or 1980s, which have been allowed to fester. We still have tens of thousands of men and women fighting the war. It doesn't justify the gross human rights abuses that have been committed since 1980, but it does explain some of them. Until we have some process to enable us all to come to terms with our past will continue to haunt us and stunt our ability to develop. Furthermore, unscrupulous politicians will continue to exploit that past to consolidate their power. A poisoned society is not the only dreadful legacy of Zimbabwe's civil war. Another is that war itself has become acceptable in Zimbabwe, both domestically and internationally. There has never been a serious debate within Zimbabwe that our civil war was avoidable. It is just a given that there were never any other alternatives. While it is mere speculation, of course, and written with the benefit of hindsight, the fact remains that our war, this is my belief, was avoidable. I have no doubt that had Todd remained in power, like de Klerk in South Africa, he would have done everything possible to avoid war. It is hard to imagine him detaining nationalist leaders rather than talking to them. Furthermore, the likes of Martin Luther King are not eulogized in Zimbabwe. It is almost sacrilegious to suggest that had nationalist leaders used non-violent methods, war might have been avoided, even in the face of RF oppression. Whether the RF could have been defeated by Gandhian methods is a moot point. But the tragedy is that that suggestion is not even up for debate. War is considered an acceptable means of resolving major national or international problems, and that culture is reflected by our ready engagement in Gukuruhundi, Murambatsvina, Mozambique, and the DRC since independence. It is also demonstrated in our massive defense spending at the expense of education, health, and housing. Thank you. Okay.
That was a bit novel, and but I dare say unorthodox. Sort of just read some passages. Suppose the author can turn around and say, I encourage you to read the book yourself, but I'm sure that we will tease out the issues. Allow me, David, if you don't mind, not to suggest that the other parts were not important, but to just zero in on the part when you talked about Zimbabwe as a country experiencing excruciating levels of post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've long argued that in this country, South Africa, we are a traumatized state, that we've never dealt with the violence and the brutality of the past, that the greatest threat to this country is not a threat to democracy, that what might even be happening in the ruling party might turn out to be good for democracy. It is the social crisis that's playing itself out in this country, and the levels of anger that's in the society stemming in the main, not from what happened post-94, but the unresolved issues of pre-settlement South Africa. Thank you for that. I'm now going to call on the other two colleagues. Let me just introduce them very briefly. Professor David Moore is a professor and head of Department of Development Studies here at UJ, a former professor of development studies at UKZN, the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is a researcher on Zim and has been researching Zimbabwean questions since 1984. He says the one challenge for him is that he hasn't quite figured out what is really happening in Zimbabwe, but will not give up on trying to understand what's going on there. Piers Pigu, I've already introduced Piers briefly, but he's a senior consultant for the ICG, that's the International Crisis Group, and has held that position since 2011. Played prominent roles in NGOs in South Africa, particularly dealing with issues of justice and reconciliation. He's actually worked with the International Center for International Justice. Is that the New York-based one? Transitional Justice, that's the New York-based one. Worked on South African History Archive, worked with Zimbabwe Torture Victims Project, and the Truth Commission. I've known Piers for a long time, and I say steeped on Zimbabwean matters. Professor David Moore, over to you. Please welcome Professor David Moore. The other David.
I'm older than that one, just by a couple of years. Thanks, Chris, for organizing this, and thanks to librarians, and thank you so much, David Coltart, for writing this excellent book. It's 601 pages, I think, without footnotes. But it's a clean read. It's straightforward. It's got a narrative which unfolds naturally, and there's a very good writing style there. And I think it's within a tradition of Zimbabwean autobiographies. Wilfred Mahandas. Sort of starts out with the day of birth and goes on throughout history as that person has lived it. And as you're getting there, you get these brilliant insights into the other personalities, into your own philosophy, what keeps you going. And as these books emerge, we're getting a very interesting and complex view of Zimbabwean history. When I was getting to the last 100 pages last night, a neighbor was texting me about other things, and I said, well, I can't talk now, I'm getting through this 100 pages. And the person says, oh yeah, Coulthard, is a Zimbabwean. Oh yeah, Coulthard, a diehard Rhodesian, huh? So I was thinking, what is a diehard Rhodesian? You're supposed to wear short trousers, a bit, you know.
No socks.
No socks, living on a farm, losing a farm. But I was thinking, you know, this is not a diehard Rhodesian. This is anything but a diehard Rhodesian, whatever that concept means. I think when you read this book, you get a compassionate, deeply religious man with clear liberal beliefs about society. When David and I first met in 2004, David told me a story about his belief, why he joined the police in Rhodesia, and how he turned. Again, the book talks about his life at UCT as a law student and how he got involved in the Crossroads Legal Advice Center. And you don't say this bit in the book, but you talk about a history class with Ian Phimister. Now, this is getting to sort of academic storytelling here, but Ian Phimister, a Marxist economic historian, back in 1980, was teaching at UCT. And he said to his students, don't worry about Mugabe, he's not a Marxist. Because David was telling me he was, you know, an anti-communist, a liberal from early days. And so Phimister said, nah, don't worry, Mugabe's not a Marxist, he's just another typical African dictator in the making. And so this inspired David to start up what is now still running, the Zimbabwe Society, and he talks in the book about trying to bring Zimbabwean politicians down and so on. But the Phimister story goes back to a whole range of conflicts in the academic world about how to handle Mugabeism. Apparently now it's even an ideology, Zimbabwean history. And it kind of starts out with who started out to be a real liberal nationalist historian, Terry Ranger. And in 1980, Terry Ranger was telling the whole world that Mugabe was a Castro-like leader. He had brought in all the youthful leaders of a radical group which was contesting him. So there was this, you know, how to put Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF in world ideologies, in history of African politics. Margaret Thatcher was quite convinced Robert Mugabe was anti-communist in the 1980s because that's why he got away with Gukurahundi. Because the feeling was in the Western world that this was the guy who could keep the Soviet Union out and keep an eye on the ANC, which was seen as a communist puppet, you know. So we're dealing with an ideology and a man here who's extremely pragmatic, opportunistic. I mean, I'm talking about Mugabe, not you. You're straightforward. This guy is straight. It's a clear ideology there of liberalism. One thing I want to kind of ask you is where you're quite clear in the book where your Christianity comes from, and you do use that politically. There's excellent bits in the book about where there's a quote you use in Parliament from Isaiah or whoever, which really points the political finger. So that police officer was quite right. But where does liberalism come from? Where do you have a strong economic sense of liberalism, free market, and a political sense of liberalism, freedom of speech and assembly and all of that. I don't quite get where that comes from, unless it's just from that one sole moment of Garfield Todd. I don't know. But how do you pick that up in a society which has never really been very liberal, ever? 50 years of tyranny, or go back further. Anyway, the book goes on, following, childhood conflicts with it. His parents actually, in his youth, his parents were much more liberal than he was. And those are very interesting sections. Legal training through the 70s and the 80s. Excellent history there. You kept a very good diary, or you have a very good memory, probably both, because some of those episodes of Gukurahundi are absolutely terrifying, but clear and unbiased. There's a sense there in which facts rule, and there's a sense of real fairness. I don't think there's an angry moment in that book where you splash it out against a particular politician. You're probably too fair with some people. I think there's one little moment there where you have one of the deputy prime ministers who's jumping into her Mercedes-Benz with lots of ministerial aides and that sort of thing. But you have a light touch, so it's a very fair book, and I think that comes out in your in your section about post-trauma and that sort of thing. So it's a very well balanced book. But some of these facts are pretty interesting and new. The disputes that led to the split in the main MDC party and led to you joining the Mutambara Nube party. The discussions about international assistance, and I think that's another question I would like to ask. What is the role of international assistance now that Zimbabwe is probably not in the limelight like it was before? And when somebody's going to say, oh, well, David was going around the world collecting money from the imperialists and so on, I just like to remember that very famous quote. Maybe it's not so famous. When Robert Mugabe back in the early 1960s was interviewed by an American consul in the Secretariat, and they were having fights, the trade unions then were having spars about the use of foreign money. And the trade unions were just beginning to split into ZAPU and ZANU trade unions. And so this American guy, and this is in a book by Tim Scarnecchia, who found this lovely quote in the archives. This American guy is saying to Robert Mugabe, well, what do you think about foreign funding and political parties in Rhodesia? And so Mugabe says back, well, of course, we need foreign funding. We don't have workers who earn much money to put into the trade union coffers. There's not a great deal of wage there that workers can put in their annual checkoffs, monthly checkoffs. Political parties, there aren't very many rich people in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia to fund political parties. And besides, it would be illegal under Ian Smith. So Robert Mugabe says to this American, of course we need foreign funding. The question is, when you ride the tiger, not to end up inside. So there's an interesting dialogue in there, dialectic, between the necessity for a struggle for democracy, which comes from within, which is clearly there, but there's not a lot of resources. So of course you have to spend a lot of time internationally. So I'd like you to kind of get in on that one. What's happening now? Where do you think Zimbabwe sits in that? And what are some of the dilemmas of having to rely a lot on outside sources? Some of the details in there of David's time in the cabinet during the Government of National Unity 2009 to 2013 are fascinating. And you'll see how hard a worker David was, and when he was Minister of Education, Sports, Arts and Culture, right? And now are they 4 separate ministries? So you were doing 4 jobs at once. Getting those textbooks published, working with permanent secretaries who were politically completely against the project of getting the schools running again. Those are some of the most amazing chapters. And there you can see David's willingness to forgive, I guess. Worked with the people who had done Gukurahundi with the goal of getting education back on track in Zimbabwe. And of course, as you know, Zimbabwe is quite famous for its excellent educational system. And I guess it's coming back now, partly thanks to David's work. There's a very, very interesting statistic there that comes out of one of the cabinet meetings in 2012, where it indicates how hard it was for Tendai Biti, who was the Minister of Finance working with the MDC, but in a coalition or a government of national unity. How hard it was to get taxation into the system when that money from the diamonds was being siphoned off into various boots of cars and so on. So we had 39 million US dollars. Remember, we're talking about US dollars for the president's office. We had $8 million for your ministry. That's why so much international lobbying had to go along with what UNICEF and so on to fund the textbooks. And there's a little discussion there of $98 million for a national defense college, right? So that gives an indication of the priorities of this state, of this party that we're still dealing with now. So it's a meticulous, I say the word easy read because it's smooth, it's well written, but it's not easy to read because you see the violence, you see the political mess that happens when you have a party which loses its way, or at least it loses one way. The famous Mozambican a luta continua turns into the looting continues, right? So buy it as quickly as you can. The questions, I still want to know what drives political actors to power, be that for good or evil. Because I think when people are writing their autobiographies, they're a little bit modest, right? So somebody approaches you, well, maybe I can do some good. But what's the drive there to get into politics for you and other people? What have you learned from yourself and from your history here? Where does liberalism come from in a political context like Southern Africa, where it's a pretty minority stance? The position now for Zimbabwe globally, and what you see happening as the elections begin to emerge 2018, because like your last sections, you're following up to the end of 2014 very, very clearly and in very interesting ways. And of course, we see what's going on with ZANU-PF now. You haven't lost the political bug, whatever it is. You can tell by reading that book. You're very much a political animal. So a few little predictions. And thank you very much for writing a fantastic book.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yes, you can stand, you can sit. Right up to you.
No, I'll stand if you can hear me. Otherwise, my circulation will get cut off. But thank you, Chris, and thanks very much for ambushing me yesterday. It's I never turn down an opportunity for an audience if that's possible, and I'll try and keep it brief though. My own focus is really going to be more on well, it's actually twofold. It's on the contemporary, but then also on relating to the last section that David referred to, which is the looking back and the reconciliation process, because those mirror the two areas where I've been focused in terms of my professional engagement here in South Africa for the last 25 years. I am not originally from here, so I'm not only am I a white male, I'm a foreign white male. So I'm just putting that, which also David Moore is, but he betrays that with his accent. I'd like to also start off by saying that I think that this is a must-read book. I, as I said, was ambushed yesterday, so I only got to start reading it yesterday, and so I immediately went to the last 150 pages, having read the introductory chapter, and then that. So I can't really comment very much on the middle sections, and I certainly want to get my teeth into that at a later stage. But I have to say that in terms of the more contemporaneous material as it relates to the mid-2000s onwards, and particularly the insights into the global political agreement, the government of national unity, the constitution-making process, and then subsequently those last tidbits relating to where we are now. it is a remarkable and not often we have an opportunity to get those kinds of insights so quickly after they have actually happened. And they play, I think, an important role and raise a number of extremely important issues that relate to the contemporary challenges facing Zimbabwe as it heads towards elections again in less than 30 months' time. That presupposes that the current president either stays in place, but otherwise we're going to have an election within 3 months, in theory at least, of a president being incapacitated or dying in office. The Crisis Group has just released a report this week on the current state of affairs in Zimbabwe, and I have to say it is a sobering and an unhappy read. Not everyone is on the same page as it relates to that, and I do think that there is a tendency in the post-2013 period, since ZANU-PF has been back firmly in office, to look at this government through rose-tinted glasses. The bottom line is that the economy is in a shambles, and things are getting worse for the vast majority of Zimbabweans. Fewer people today are employed in the formal sector than they were at independence. 90% of Zimbabweans exist in the informal economy. Large sections of that are propped up by a diaspora that sends money back from different parts of the world. The devaluation of the rand in 20% over last year has had a severe impact on remittances in Zimbabwe. People are being squeezed, and the survival options, which I think David Coulthard lays the base of why we are in this space today. He lays that out very clearly. And I think there's a lot more that could be added to what he says, but it's an incredibly important contribution to a debate around the contemporary dynamics and what is possible in the current context. So you know, my question to David is, I'd like really to know, well, I'd like to see another book really about the government of national unity, really, because I think that there's so much in there, and the contemporary period, which I have hundreds of questions I could ask you about that period, because I think that those insights from a position of being inside the executive and the limitations of how you can operate are a critical part of our understanding of what's realistic and what's feasible in terms of moving forward. We tend to operate within paradigms of normative frameworks about what should be. But we do need to understand what's happened and what's possible, both in terms of omission and commission. And I think those kinds of insights, which are rare, are incredibly important for the contemporary debate in terms of how we might move forward in Zimbabwe. Because if I can quote one former ZANU-PF Politburo member I spoke to last month in Harare, he described the situation as not a slither of hope. He doesn't see any hope anywhere in Zimbabwe at the moment in the contemporary situation. And while many people think that the passing of Mr. Mugabe is somehow going to be the opening of a door to a brave new world, I want to caution people that it is no panacea for Zimbabwe, and that there is a range of structural defects in that country, which I think David's book provides a framework for us to understand why we're in this space. Just with respect to the looking back, I think this is, and I would agree, this is the most important contribution of this book, because it provides a reflection on a range of extremely difficult issues over this 50-year period. I remember actually the first time I actually had an interaction, he probably doesn't remember it because it was more indirect, with David Coulthard, which was in 2003 or 4. Wasn't face-to-face, but I was involved in a symposium in Johannesburg that was looking at dealing with the past in Zimbabwe, and of which 60 or 70 Zimbabwean NGOs had come to Johannesburg to have a 3-day discussion about this. Part of that discussion, of course, was looking at the thorny issue of prosecutions and criminal accountability. And there was an interaction going on between some of the delegates and David, who was, I think, a justice rep in the joint MDC.
Shadow Justice Minister.
That's right. At that time, the shadow minister. So he was hot on this subject, but he was, if I recall correctly, pretty nervous about some of the subject matter and some of the lines that were being taken within that conference in terms of the delicate negotiations that were taking place at the time between the MDC and ZANU-PF. And I think that it's interesting now to reflect on that 12, 13 years later, to what extent a bolder move should have been taken and could have been taken at that time around that particular set of issues. But you know, Zimbabwe, while the cry for dealing with the past is an important one, and in the contemporary setting, we have a rather problematic National Peace and Reconciliation Act that has recently been passed and will, I think, successfully be challenged in the Constitutional Court. The opportunities for dealing with the past have been enhanced, I think, by an enormous amount of work that's been done by Zimbabwean civil society over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of preparing for space when this comes along. I don't think there is any comparison, having worked in the transitional justice field for some time, I don't think there's any comparison anywhere in the world where there has been this level of discussion and debate about what could be possible. We're a long way, of course, from actually having those kinds of honest debates. And I think precisely what David talks about in terms of the need to engage where there are perpetrators and victims across the nation who have never had that opportunity to speak. This is a critical part of that process which will need to take place. But I want to say that an enormous amount has been done. Some of the archive has been preserved. ZAPU's own archive and the Zipra archive is actually sitting here safe and sound in Johannesburg in a place. Records from the Gukurahundi are safe outside of the country. So certain repositories have been preserved, but there is an enormous amount that has been lost in terms of contemporaneous records and personal knowledge that has been lost because 30 odd years have passed around some key sectors of sections of the past and the conflicts of the past. We have that our own experience here in South Africa of losing an enormous opportunity and the rather naive reflections on South Africa's own Truth Commission, the notion that any kind of commission can resolve or engage such an enormous amount of work and challenges is, of course, unrealistic. And it's important to remember that any of those processes, and this will go for Zimbabwe as well, those processes are a catalyst, a foundation for future engagement, for a conversation that will not just finish when those commissions finish. The tragedy in South Africa is that we had a political compact which effectively cut off any future discussion from those issues once the commission had finished its official work. I very much hope that in Zimbabwe, that when you do get the opportunity to have a proper engagement with the past, that it's an investment in a much longer term process, that this is not just about simply having an institution that ticks a box and allows you to move on. But David, I think this is a critically important contribution. I think it opens the door for lots and lots of questions. I have no doubt you are going to get lots of abuse from those that selectively engage with that. But I do feel, from what I've read, it's an honest account and it's a critical part of a conversation that continues to need to be had. Thank you.
Thank you.
I still consider him a friend, so I can say this. For somebody with 24 hours notice to join the panel, you were remarkably coherent. I'm not coherent at the best of times. Give me 3 weeks notice, it won't help. So well done to you peers. So Dave, I'm going to smuggle in 2 questions. Don't have to answer them now. As I open up, and by the way, fasten your seatbelts, all 3 of you. We come into the audience in a moment. So I've got 2 questions for you that I would like to ask. The one is, in the context of, in South Africa certainly, and I dare say it's an issue that's still on the agenda in Zimbabwe, but in the context of the race and racism debate having again reared its ugly head in this country, what do you make of the statement that I'm about to make that white South Africans, white Rhodesians in this case, Rhodesians, white Zimbabweans, often behave like the victims when in fact they have a lot of honest accounting to do for their roles in the past. I know it sounds a bit harsh, so I just want to ask you about that one. Now, let me park the second one. I don't want to hog the show. I'm going to open.
Do you want me to answer that now?
Oh, that one.
That you've just
All the
asked?
others. Sure.
I've got this. I actually deal with that in one section of the book. I recount a rally that we had in the days just prior to the 2000 election. There was a sense of euphoria in the country. There was a sense that finally Robert Mugabe, ZANU-PF were going to be beaten. And at one of those final rallies in Bulawayo, in my constituency, we had a very well attended rally, and the vast majority of people attending that rally were white. And I felt the need to address that very point because I was concerned by some of the feedback I was getting from white supporters. People who were saying, finally, they wouldn't be as crude as this, saying we're going to go back to Rhodesia, but there was no sense of their complicity in everything that, in a lot of things that had happened in Zimbabwe. There was no understanding that torture started in Rhodesia, for example. And so I spoke to that theme at this meeting. I think everyone was taken by surprise because I think they thought I was going to come in and have a tub-thumping address about how we were going to finally get rid of Mugabe. And that was the mood. There was euphoria. But I addressed this, and I said to the audience, we as whites need to understand our complicity in the mess that afflicts Zimbabwe. And I was met not with a stunned silence, but certainly there were ripples of discontent in the audience. And the next morning, one of my key campaign team, a white man, phoned me to complain and said, why did you use this opportunity to attack the white community? The white community, it was in the middle of murders of white farmers and the like, but it illustrated to me just what you're saying. That, and unfortunately, it's because I think there was never a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have never been forced to confront some of the things that happen. I speak about Inyadzonya. Inyadzonya, for the South Africans who don't know it, was an event which was lauded by the Rhodesian security forces in 1976. It was a raid into Mozambique, and the Rhodesians put it across that this was a raid into a training camp. But even the Rhodesian version came out that some 2,000 young people were killed in a space of about 2 hours. And in this firefight, there wasn't a single fatality on the Rhodesian side. It was a turkey shoot. At the time, it was lauded as this great military victory. We've never had to confront what happened at Inyadzonya. And I think perhaps white South Africans as well. I said to Dennis Davis, who was my interlocutor on Tuesday, that unfortunately, I think both white Zimbabweans and white South Africans have such short horizons. Their belief is that the legacy of apartheid wasn't as damaging as it has been. And whites certainly need to extend their horizons and realize, as I said earlier, that I don't believe we're going to work out several centuries of oppression in just a few years or even a few decades. It's going to take a long time. But I want to end this response on one point. What I've tried to convey throughout the book is a sense of hope. It's not a pessimistic book. I'm not an Afro-pessimist, I'm an Afro-optimist. And I think that if the white community understand better about that legacy, there is still a future. That is my experience in Zimbabwe. I fought for Smith, but I believe that I have a future, and my children, my granddaughter over there have a future in Zimbabwe. But it's because I think we've changed our mindset. And it's still a journey. That's why I said right at the beginning, the struggle continues not just for Zimbabwe, but David Coulthard. It's going to be an ongoing struggle for the rest of my life because we have this baggage.
Thanks for begging me to answer that question. That was great. That's a very important question. Okay. The floor is open. It's now really over to a very patient audience. Just the rules of the game. I'm going to start this week from the left. The left.